Washington, D.C. Not the place you think of as having monsters around, if you don't count the people. But just 10 miles outside of the beltway of D.C. politics, a mere stone's throw from George Washington's backyard at Mount Vernon, is an area that in the late 70s and early 80s was the home to a real monster. Welcome to the In-Between. I'm Carol Ann, and thanks to our awesome In-Betweener, Steve, that's exactly where we go for today's episode to investigate the Mount Vernon Monster. I am very willing to admit that I learn about new cryptids and stories and legends from our viewers every day. But I think this is the first time one of our in-betweeners has sent me not only a story I'd never heard before, but a ton of evidence to back it up. Steve introduced me to the Mount Vernon Monster with tons of stories and resources to check out. So I did. What I found is a mountain of not just stories, but newspaper articles to back it all up. And since this was all in a time period of just a few years between 1977 and 1983 or so, video wasn't really a thing like it is today. But we actually have the next best thing: audio. But let me start back at the beginning. Way back in about 1976 or so, around the Alexandria area of Virginia, the backyard of George Washington's home, Mount Vernon, which back then was still pretty undeveloped with large areas of undisturbed woods and swamps, residents began hearing a wailing scream at night. Now, this was not just your average suburb. Many of the houses out there were $150,000 houses on the golf course. Considering inflation and Alexandria's real estate market back then, that means well over $1 million in today's dollars. So these were people who were paying a lot of money to live in what was supposed to be a nice quiet area. Thelma Crisp, who lived on Old Union Farm Road, was one of the many residents who heard the wails. The police told Thelma to keep quiet, but plenty of other residents didn't. Descriptions of the sound ran the whole gamut, from a wild boar, really loud frogs, some guy blowing in a wine bottle, a barred owl, a broken microphone on a CB outfit, a parrot, a mouse with an amplifier, a strangled dog, the ghost of George Washington, and the ghost of George Washington's pigs. This went on for years. Not every night, but off and on over a 5 or 6 year period. People living in the area tried to figure out where the screams were coming from. Dogs would go nuts and kids were getting scared. So some residents called the police, who brought in 6 officers and a helicopter to stake out the woods for a night. But surprise, that didn't work. So then the police called Ralph Stickman, the Fairfax County game warden. He just thought it was a hoax and spent several nights sitting in the woods with a flashlight, sure he would one day find the speakers that the hoaxers must be using. Nothing. All he could say was, "The thing seems to know when you leave the woods. Then it will holler." I don't know what it is, to be frank. Michael Berger, a PhD in wildlife management who worked for the National Wildlife Federation, or NWF, heard the night sounds and didn't think they sounded human. It's hard to describe. It is a series of screams, not really screams, more like wails. They seem to be fairly close to Thelma's house. His opinions, according to an NWF spokesman, do not necessarily reflect the official view of the National Wildlife Federation. But Thelma didn't just hear it. She saw it in her backyard and described it as being about 6 feet tall and walking upright. And she's not the only one. But before we get too far down that road, let's get back to Steve's personal experience and those of his friends. Steve's family moved into the Hayfield Farms neighborhood, which is sandwiched between the Huntley Meadows Park and Fort Belvoir, around 1975. That same year, he finds what looks like a lean-to shelter in a densely wooded area in Fort Belvoir, over towards the backside of Woodlawn Plantation. There, he finds a tree that's been snapped over about 7 to 8 feet up, with pretty big logs piled against it. No saw marks, no axe marks. And please keep in mind that the area has changed a lot in the last 50 years, so the map areas I am showing you are rough estimates of the areas involved. Later that same year, a friend of Steve's who lived a block away from Steve, but his house was right on the tree line, they had rabbit hutches in their backyard. And one night, those rabbit hutches are just ripped apart. The next morning, all that's left is rabbit hutch debris and a blood trail going into the woods. No rabbits and no predators in the area big enough to pull off a job like that. Steve's friend's family was from Oregon, so he thought it was a Bigfoot. But Steve thought, no way, Bigfoot only lives in remote areas. One cold January night in 1976, Steve is cutting through a densely wooded area in Fort Belvoir on his way home. He doesn't see anything, but a feeling of dread comes over him, like he's being watched, which he says is a pretty typical occurrence. As he's walking, trying not to think about that being watched feeling, he hears a loud crack. He keeps walking, but can hear movement in the trees. When he stops, it stops. But whatever it is, doesn't follow him very far. However, Steve leaves the forest that night with the distinct impression that whatever that thing was, it was trying to communicate with him telepathically. About a year later, some of Steve's friends are back in the woods one night, roughly 150 feet from the infamous Bunny Hutch massacre, when something huge comes crashing through the woods like a bulldozer, grunting and growling, and knocks over a rotten tree. They can't exactly see what is on the warpath because there's no moon out that night, but they don't stick around to find out either and run out of the woods in sheer terror. About another year later, 1978, another friend has an encounter. One afternoon, Steve's friend and 3 other guys are hanging out about 100 yards back in the woods when they notice what they thought was a tree stump in the distance has now gotten closer. Anyone else thinking of Doctor Who's Weeping Angels? The tree stump is about 6 to 7 feet long, on all 4s, covered in dark hair, and is making grunting and growling noises. Remember, no bears in this area. Nobody says a word, and in one group, they nope it out of there as fast as they can. And another year or so after that, around 1979 or 1980-ish, Steve finds a deer impaled on a 4-foot-tall, flat-topped metal fence pole near the tree line. He and his friends stand there trying to figure out how this deer managed to impale itself on a flat-top metal fence post. Never occurs to them that maybe they don't want to find out. But after all the excitement of the last 5 or 6 years and the discovery of one more lean-to-like structure that looked like it hadn't been used in a while, whatever was living in those woods seemingly moved on to greener pastures by the early to mid-80s. According to Steve, he and his friends were naturally mystified by all the things that they'd experienced, but thought that there's no way it can be a Bigfoot or a Dogman because they're like less than 20 miles from Washington, D.C. Okay, so after reading through all of this information from Steve, I had to go look for some corroborating evidence, something that didn't just come from Steve. It didn't take long. In fact, I found evidence of 2 separate Mount Vernon monsters, but the other one is in Illinois. Story for another day. But for the Virginia Mount Vernon Monster, I immediately found an episode of the Spaced Out Radio podcast where paranormal and Bigfoot researcher Glenn Jackson tells his own harrowing account with this creature. As a kid living in the area, of course, all of the parents have heard about something going on and they're telling their kids to stay out of the woods, which naturally makes Glenn and his friends go into the woods. They're walking through somewhere relatively close to the golf course. Side note, there are a number of mentions of a golf course in these stories, but there are actually 2 courses in the area, so I'm not sure which golf course is being talked about. They climb up this little rise to see someone sitting by a little pond area. And they think it's the groundskeeper to the golf course until it stands up and looks at them. That's when they realize it's not even human. Time to go. From where they are, they decide their best exit plan is to run across the greens of the golf course and hop the fence on the other side. As they're running, this thing is staying in the woods but keeping up with them, crashing his way through the woods like a bulldozer. Glenn and his friends come out to an old dirt fire road. The path that this thing is on comes out at a spot where there's a chain link fence with barbed wire on the top. This creature actually flips itself over the fence, clearing the barbed wire, runs across the dirt road into a creek area, and crouches down, staring at the kids. They all take off down the road, not looking back. What does Glenn remember about the creature? Nothing, except its pearl white teeth. Could this be the reason he became a paranormal researcher? Maybe. The next thing I discovered was something Steve had discovered too, a forum thread from fairfaxunderground.com with tons of people commenting, some in the hoax camp and some in the real camp. But there are so many accounts on this thread of people telling their stories of encountering this creature or hearing the screams, even retired police officers, that it's hard to just dismiss all of that. One story that Steve shared that came from this thread is from a resident who had way too close of an encounter. Is from a poster by the name of Steve Squatch. Different Steve. This Steve says he first heard about the Mount Vernon Monster in the Alexandria Gazette in 1979, but didn't exactly go into the woods to check it out until 1983. He and his buddy go out and hang out in the woods for about a half an hour, don't hear anything, so they decide to go back to the car to get warm. When they get there, they are greeted by 3 squad cars with cops asking them what they're doing. And they tell the police, "We're here to listen for the monster." The cop that they're actually talking to laughs at them and tells them, "I don't believe in that thing." As soon as those words cross his lips, a blood-curdling scream erupts from within the woods about 100 feet from where they're standing. The officer tells Steve and his friends, "Go home," and takes off toward his cruiser. All the cars take off down Old Union Farm Road with their spotlights on, trying to find where the scream came from. Steve and his friend went home. But after hearing the screams a few more times, much further away this time, and even seeing its steamy breath on a cold evening from the woods next to the golf course, curiosity gets the better of Steve, who heads out looking for the monster again, but with 4 friends this time. They park their car and walk a little ways to hang out on the bridge that sits at the entrance to the Old Union Farm property. As they pass the time with a game or 10 of 20 questions, Steve keeps hearing these wood-knocking sounds. He says to his buddies, "Hey, that's the 3rd time I've heard those knocks." Before anyone has a chance to answer, a scream explodes from the woods only about 25 feet from where they are standing. That's the bad news. The really bad news is that they have to run right by that spot to get back to their car. They all start running anyway, and as they pass the spot where the first scream came from, another scream rips through the night air. Steve describes it as an all-enveloping sound that he could feel, like it was going to knock him over. He estimates that they're only 10 to 12 feet from the second scream and absolutely rejects the idea that it's just some kids with a set of speakers playing a prank. After all of his years hunting, fishing, and camping in the woods, he knows that no known animal makes that sound. That night, only 2 of the 5 friends went into the woods as believers, but they all were believers when they left. Steve says, "People can be skeptics all they want. That's their choice. But when you experience something like my friends and I did, you never forget it and question a lot of your former beliefs." Another story mentioned by both our InBetweener Steve and the people on the Fairfax Underground Forum comes from an incident report posted on the BFRO website. So I took a look, and there is a report on file from someone stationed at Davison U.S. Army Airfield near Fort Belvoir as a military policeman from 1977 to 1979. He doesn't give his name, so we're going to call him Dan. The airfield is pretty small and surrounded by woods and a small swamp, much less developed than it is now. From the moment Dan starts his MP assignment at Davison, he is warned by other MPs to look out for the DUSSA swamp monster. Sure enough, several times when Dan was part of the two-man patrol around the perimeter at night, he and whoever he was with that night would hear big branches breaking and unfamiliar animal noises that he never heard anywhere else again until he listened to recordings of Sasquatch vocalizations. They struck a familiar nerve. But perimeter check wasn't the worst job. At least there you had a partner. The worst job was the solo night shift out at the guard gate off of Route 1, the airfield's main entrance. The small guard shack faces south, where across the highway, Dan would hear wood knocks and see deer booking it out of the woods like they were running from something. One night, around 10 p.m., a car turns in from Route 1, races up to the gate where a guy gets out, totally freaked, and tells Dan to call the state patrol. When Dan asks him why, he says this big, hairy thing just walked across the road right in front of him and headed onto Fort Belvoir property. He almost hit it. In fact, Dan could see his skid marks on the road when he came to work the next evening, right where the guy said he saw it. At first, the driver thought it was a guy in a gorilla suit. Then it was way too tall to be a man. And while the experience is pretty freaky, Dan is not all that shocked. This is not the first time he has heard of people, even state troopers, seeing things crossing the road between Davison Field and Fort Belvoir. It happened all the time, year-round. But the one night that still haunts Dan all these years later is one particular summer night in 1978. He's in the guard shack and sees a deer break from the woods to his right and start following the fence line, trying to get anywhere else, when he hears some kind of noise coming from the woods. He yells out, thinking it's a person, but is greeted with red, glowing eyes just inside the wood line and just outside of the range of the streetlight. Being pretty dang familiar with the terrain, Dan estimates the eyes were shining at about 7 to 8 feet off the ground. Small tangent, Fort Belvoir is not only known for its Bigfoot sightings, it's got a famous UFO sighting to its credit as well. In September 1957, an Army private stationed there hears his fellow soldiers calling for him, so he goes to see what's going on. And there in the sky, seen by all of them, is a black ring-shaped UFO. The private grabs his Brownie camera and takes 6 pictures. After about 5 minutes, the UFO vanishes. However, the incident is so well documented and witnessed that the Condon Report, also known as the Scientific Study of Unidentified Flying Objects, published in 1968, devoted 11 pages of its 1,500-page report to this particular encounter. But back to the Mount Vernon Monster. One person in the Fairfax Underground thread, named Logan, tells the story told to him by his dad, Doug. Doug lived somewhere close to the golf course and had heard all of the kerfuffles about something being in the woods. Now, in this case, I'm pretty sure we are talking about this golf course, and I'll tell you why in just a second. Doug even hears that whatever this thing is, it can make the toughest German Shepherd back down and refuse to enter the woods. Doug talks to his neighbor, Thelma Crisp. Remember her? She's the one who saw it in her backyard. Her house is on Old Union Farm Road, and it backs up to the woods next to the golf course. So Doug asks her if he can use her roof for a stakeout. Thelma says, "Sure." So Doug goes up and sits on her roof, sometimes even bringing his girlfriend. And right before dark, or maybe a little after, something would start throwing golf balls out of the woods onto Thelma's lawn. Getting a bit more courageous, Doug decides to set himself up inside of an old abandoned barn in the woods during the day to see if anything would happen. As he's sitting inside, bam! A giant log hits the side of the barn. Doug goes outside to see what's going on and sees the log, but doesn't see what threw it. But his wish to actually see this thing comes true one evening as he's walking on a trail going through the woods around dusk. So it's pretty dark inside the woods. As he's walking along, he sees something really big in the middle of the trail. But before he can get close enough to see what it is that's blocking the trail, it moves to the side, off the trail, and into the woods. He doesn't really give any more detail than that, but his son Logan says that whatever he saw profoundly affected him for the rest of his life. Doug doesn't even share his story with his kids until they're older, but when he does, he shares even more than just a story. He shares proof. He has the wails of this creature on audio tape. Now, before I play this clip, please note that we've cleaned it up as much as we could to make it a bit easier to hear without changing the sound of the monster itself, and edited the whole clip down for time. Take a listen. Is that insane or what? That's not like anything I've ever heard before. Back to our friend Steve. It isn't until years later that he hears the name Mount Vernon Monster and some of the stories associated with it and discovers the BFRO report that he has his aha moment and realizes that he had personally experienced the Mount Vernon Monster. Steve, I can't tell you enough how much I appreciate the hot tip and all of the wonderful stories and information. I know I am not the only one who's never heard of the Mount Vernon Monster, so thank you for putting this one on our radar. If you're in the mood for more monsters, the not human kind, click right here. Be careful out there, and I will see you here again on the In-Between.